Okay, you know who they are. They're small, they're yellow, and they speak this gibberish that somehow everyone just gets. They're the Minions. And they've gone from just being goofy sidekicks to a full-blown global cultural force. But the real question is, how? How did these little creatures become one of the most successful media franchises in history?
Okay, so to really get our heads around this, let's just dive into the sheer scale of the minion phenomenon, because honestly, the numbers they're pretty staggering. So let's start with the big one, $12.3 billion. That's the total estimated revenue of the entire Despicable Me franchise. I mean, that puts it up there with the highest grossing media properties of all time. But what's really fascinating is how that number breaks down. Get this, a staggering $6 billion of that comes just from retail sales. We're talking about a massive commercial empire built on literally everything, from lunchboxes and pajamas to phone cases and, yeah, even household wipes. And the other half? Well, that's pure box office muscle. The films themselves have raked in $5.6 billion around the world, making Despicable Me the most successful animated film franchise ever. So yeah, the money is undeniable. But that just makes the mystery even deeper. So, what is the secret sauce here? Why do these little guys resonate with audiences in pretty much every corner of the globe? Let's break down the most common reasons people give for their universal appeal. Well, a huge part of the explanation is that their humor just doesn't need to be translated. They rely on physical gags, not witty dialogue. So their comedy works everywhere, and it kind of echoes the universal appeal of old-school silent films. And you can really see the direct line here, right? Doesn't matter if it's 100 years ago or today, the language of slapstick, the falling down, the silly faces, all that chaotic energy, it's completely universal. So when you boil it down, it's just this perfect cocktail of simple, wholesome fun. They're colorful, they're cute, and they're totally apolitical. It's an easy escape for all ages, anywhere in the world, with no complicated dialogue or controversy to get in the way. But here's where the story takes a really fascinating turn. Some analysis out there suggests there's a much deeper, maybe even subversive layer to what the Minions are all about. And it has a lot less to do with comedy and way more to do with labor. And this brings us to a pretty radical idea. What if the Minions' entire history isn't a search for the best villain, but a search for employment? I mean, think about it. If you look at their backstory, it's basically a resume. From serving a T-Rex, to building pyramids, to working for Gru, their entire existence is defined by this endless quest, not for an evil ideology, but for a master to serve, a boss to work for. In fact, the narrator in their own movie tells us this point blank. For a minion, being unemployed isn't freedom. It's an existential crisis. It threatens their very reason for being. Okay, so let's really dive into this critical theory, because it frames the Minions in a completely different and honestly much darker light. So to unlock this whole critique, we need to understand a specific term that sociologists use for the modern workforce, the precariat. It basically describes a class of people living with constant uncertainty and zero job security. And this is where it gets a little eerie, right? When you look at the profile, the Minions fit it perfectly. They're interchangeable, they're desperate for any job, and you can move them anywhere. They even wear a permanent working-class uniform. But here's the kicker. They don't need wages, they don't need time off, and they don't need a safety net. And you see this scene from the movie, where a minion sees himself multiplied into infinity in a hall of mirrors? Well, that visually represents a core idea of this critique, a seemingly endless supply of identical, cheap labor. And that endless supply just completely undermines any individual power they might have. So, if the Minions are a symbol of the working class, then why don't we see them as this, revolutionary force? Why aren't they storming the castle? Well, their one big act of rebellion is completely paradoxical. They don't strike for better conditions or more freedom. They go on strike because their boss, Gru, isn't giving them enough of the evil work they crave. It's a strike for more work, not less. And their cuteness, it turns out, is a brilliant tool of control. The very things that make them so funny, the zaniness, the gibberish, that frantic energy, also make it so any act of resistance can just be dismissed as irrational hysteria. It strips it of any real power. So, how do we connect these two sides of the story? You've got their massive commercial success on one hand, and this really subversive reading of them as a modern workforce on the other. How do they fit together?
Well, there's this one film theory that suggests that really popular stories can sometimes act like an ideological lullaby. They make us comfortable with the way things are by packaging it all up in a really entertaining way. And this suggests their appeal as entertainers and their symbolism as workers aren't separate things at all. In fact, one actually fuels the other. By making a life of constant precarious work seem fun and adorable, the minions basically normalize it.
And that is the final, kind of startling conclusion of this whole critique. Because they're inhuman characters who don't have real needs or desires or agency, they end up representing the perfect workforce for an inhuman system of endless, unrewarded labor.
Which leaves us with one last, pretty unsettling question to think about. The next time you see one of these little yellow creatures, just ask yourself, are you laughing with them? Or are you maybe laughing at a cartoon version of your own reality?